Hi, welcome to Toys in the Hood. So when I did my look through Rogue Trader, I only had a couple of minutes to talk about the creatures that are in Rogue Trader, and there's more than 30 of them in the book, and they're all brilliant, so I really wanted to give them a proper look, so that's what we're doing today. Now, I'm not interested in the races that make up the kind of main worlds of the Imperium and the armies, so, you know, Orcs, Eldar, I'll talk about those more some other day maybe, but it's the really crazy creatures that inhabit the planets of the 40th millennium that I want to look at. I'm also going to look at the warp entities as well to mix it up. Worth mentioning that demons and chaos, they're not really a thing in Rogue Trader, but there are still creatures that live in the warp. So I should probably have done like a top 30 countdown, kind of, you will not believe what the most powerful creature in Warhammer 40,000 is, but I'm kind of old, and so I'm going to go through these in alphabetical order. So, A is for Amble. So Ambulls are a burrowing creature. They've got real barrel-chested bodies, they've kind of got an ape-like stance, they've got quite short legs, but very long arms, and then they've got huge expandable jaws. Their eyes are also able to see heat, so they've got infravision. Their limbs end in iron-hard claws. They use these to dig through the soft rock of their homeworld. Their homeworld is Luther McIntyre 9. Luther McIntyre 9 is one of the death worlds in Rogue Trader. A few other creatures come from there as well, including the Crawler, which is the Ambulls' favourite food. The Ambulls will chase these through the rocks at a fair speed. The Ambulls would actually arrive on the table by just appearing out of anywhere as they burrow their way up. Now, one of the things about the Amble is that it's almost identical to the Dungeons and Dragons Umberhulk, and this is also a creature that buries through the Martins and basically is a nightmare for dwarfs, whereas the Umberhulk would be a nightmare for squats. Now, Ambulls were in Rogue Trader. There was a brief white dwarf that talked about other creatures, and I think Ambulls were mentioned in that, but then they kind of disappeared. But recently they've had something of a revival. So in Blackstone Fortress, the Amble returns, but not only does the Amble return, the Amble returns with Amble larvae, which is called boarworms. So you've got smaller Ambulls. Well, they're a lot different. They change as they grow up. And then in Necromunda, there's an Ambot. So an Ambot is a robot that looks like an Amble, but then it's controlled by the nervous system of an Amble, which it's really, really dark. I mean, that asks a lot of questions. Who's going around capturing Ambulls and harvesting out their nervous systems? Although actually that does go back to something in Rogue Trader, because they have tried to domesticate Ambulls, the Imperium have, but they keep escaping. So A is also for Astral Hounds. So Astral Hounds are dark creatures that live in the warp. They basically resemble large shadowy dogs. They appear from nowhere and they attack psychers. They can actually track the psychic aura of psychic humans, psychic creatures, while they're in warp space. So they'll track someone and then suddenly they'll appear and they'll attack them. And this might just happen at home. You know, suddenly they manifest in the material world, they drag a psyker off and feed on him, and then the friends and family have no idea where he's gone. Obviously, there's not much of that in the actual wargaming table, but what you do find with Astral Hounds is they can appear from anywhere, and then they will actually chase down the nearest psyker, and they can teleport around the battlefield to do this. They're like the Hounds of Tindalos. The Hounds of Tindalos are in H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Now, the Hounds of Tindalos appear from anywhere, but what they can, well, not quite anywhere, because what they can do is they can only appear from corners. So rather than warp space in the corner of a room, a Hound of Tindalos can suddenly appear. Then there's Astral Spectres. These are another warp creature. They're basically made from psychic energy of the warp, and they're created when different types of energy combine with each other. So they hunt down psychers as well. They basically possess them when they emerge into real space. They feed on their essence, and then when you run out of essence, which in Rogue Trader, psychers have psi points which power their abilities. So it was a case of when you run out of psi points, you're then possessed by a spectre. When you're possessed by a spectre, you basically have your normal human stats and then a whole row of stats on top of it. I think it was like almost +2 across the board for that. They can also attempt to masquerade as others, and then they can manipulate the minds of weaker opponents as well, making them attack their allies. So moving on to one of my favourite creatures in Warhammer Rogue Trader, Bouncers. So Bouncers are basically, they're spherical, they're about 1 to 2 metres in diameter, they're red with yellow veins. They're essentially, the skeletons are made from inflated sections of tissue, so their body is very light, and they live on Chibal, and they follow wind currents. They've got little feet and they jump in the air, and they just bounce and travel long distances following the winds. They're inquisitive and lively creatures, but they have no real level of intelligence, although they can mimic speech and are greatly interested in what actions other creatures do. So they're not aggressive, but they could retaliate. They might jump on people and claw at them. And they're very fragile, and should their skin be pierced, they quickly deflate and die. Now, I'm pretty sure the origins of this are John Carpenter's, I think, first film, Dark Star, which is a 1974 science fiction movie. And the monster in that is basically this kind of god-awful alien that is quite literally a beach ball. But it is a red and yellow beach ball, which makes me think that it inspired these creatures. In one of the comments of my Rogue Trader read-through video, somebody did say that maybe the Bouncers were inspired by The Prisoner. Now, in The Prisoner, Agent Number 6 is captured on an island, and whenever he goes to escape, these giant white balls roll out and try to absorb people and take them back in. I think if it wasn't for the colour, I think that would be pretty similar to this. And maybe it was an influence as well. But yeah, sorry, going back to Dark Star, one of the cool things about Dark Star is it's one of the first films that introduces a sort of hypersleep, and the crew themselves go around destroying planets that are basically in the way of Earth's expansion. They're literally a demolition team going around destroying planets. So the humour fits very much with that kind of dark early 40k kind of off humour. Now C is for Carnivorous Sand Clam. A Carnivorous Sand Clam is an aquatic life form for the planet of Salutation. Now, these creatures, they live in the shallow coastal margins, and they hunt semi-aquatic animals. What they do, they've got 2 large serrated valves about 2 metres across. So these creatures are about 2 metres wide, and the clam spends most of the time submerged in the mud. When a creature steps on it, bang, it snaps in, feels the vibrations, and it captures them. Now, humans are actually too large for them to eat, but that doesn't stop them having a go at a leg and grabbing on. Now, in the game, you basically, if you walk through I don't know what you call a load of clams. Is it a school of clams? A herd of clams? A flock of clams? But when you do that and you walk into where they are basically nesting, then you find that you're trapped and you can't move until you've defeated them. Very fun random creatures. A lot of Rogue Trader creatures are designed to just add something else to the game, a little bit of a random element. Quite important to remember that Rogue Trader, you have 2 players, but you also have a games master who runs the game. So it's not like you're springing the sand clam on your opponent, but the games master will have set them up in a certain way. So when you advance in there, he's like, right, you're going to roll for this. Now, one of the better known creatures, I think, is the Catachan Devil. The Catachan Devil is native to the death world of Catachan. Catachan brings us Catachan Face-eaters, the Catachan Barking Toad, I think it is, the Catachan Brainleaf, and of course Catachan Jungle Fighters. You know, some of the toughest Imperial Guardsmen are tough because they've been brought up on the death world of Catachan, where quite simply everything is out to kill you. Now, the Catachan Devil is a kind of massive scorpion-like creature. It's actually got it's a segmented body, it's got lots and lots of pairs of legs, and then it ends in a long tail with a poisonous barb. As they grow, they develop more and more midsections and pairs of legs, so an adult can actually have 30 sets of legs and can be as long as 30 metres. The front legs, especially the older male devils, they become enlarged and they resemble like scorpion claws, and these creatures are then called fiddlers, like fiddler crabs. So in Catachan slang they're called fiddlers, and they're the most ferocious, the most powerful, and the deadliest of their kind. The head of the Catachan Devil is actually quite small and pointed with green luminous eyes, but with claws and a stingy tail, I don't think the head is your biggest worry. They can move quickly, and then the head doesn't have teeth, it actually has claws, so it kind of tears meat off you. They're quite territorial, although they come together in groups to raise their young. These are called devil spawn, the younger devils, and they're physically weaker, but they can burrow underground to get you. And the entire nests will come together to defend their territory as well, so they've actually been known to attack even Imperial Guard tank companies. So yeah, they're pretty iconic. There's never been a model made that I'm aware of. There was speculation in one of the Tyrannid codexes, I think the same one we get Von Ryan's Leapers from, that maybe the Catachan Devil is a type of Tyrannid. But that doesn't quite work, because all Tyrannids have 6 limbs. So, you know, the Tyrannid Warrior has 4 arms and 2 legs. A Termagant has 4 legs and 2 arms. Something like the Harpy has 2 wings, and then it will have 4, well, it normally has scything talons and guns, so even though it hasn't got legs, it's got 6 limbs. The Catachan Devil, as we said, can have up to 30 limbs, so I don't think it's a type of Tyrannid, although that's a pretty cool idea. And another creature from Catachan again is the Catachan Face-eater. So the Catachan Face-eater lives in kind of humid places. It hangs on branches where it will drop down on its prey. Now, essentially, it's about a ½ meter square of cloth, just hate-filled cloth, and it'll drop down on your head and it will eat your face, hence the name. Now, they can get everywhere. I think there's even some on the planet of Necromunda where they were introduced to deal with some pests at the bottom of the hive. Of course, they kind of grew out of control and now they're quite a problem. They also talk about face eaters because they like humid regions. One of the jokes in Rogue Trader is that they can end up in the bathroom, and then someone will pick them up thinking they're a flannel, go to wash their face with them. Next thing you know, it's all over the news. It's very well publicised. One of the great things about these creatures is in the game, it just says in Rogue Trader that you can just represent them by squishing out a blob of plasticine. One of the cool things about Rogue Trader is a lot of these creatures, Games Workshop are kind of like, yeah, make your own. You know, just do this. So our next one is a crawler. A crawler lives in the extensive polar deserts of Luther McIntyre 9. Unfortunately for crawlers, that's also where the Ambulls live, and the crawlers are an Amble's favourite food. Crawlers spend a lot of time just going through the ground, minding their own business. They go through dry, soft soil and loose soil. They're like squids, but they've evolved so that their front is like a single driving screw, and they use this to propel themselves through the soil. They eat microplankton mostly, but occasionally they will attack animals, and they can attack humans. People have tried to domesticate them, but again, they've just run away and they've escaped. But they have developed on several different worlds, several hundred worlds, in fact. They, like I said, like squids, they have tentacles which they use to catch their prey, and then they'll pull them into their beak-like maw. They sit there and they detect vibrations, move along the surface, and excessive or unusual vibrations will attract them. In that way, they're very much like Arrakis and the sand dunes there, the worms in the film Dune. They are attracted to motion on the surface. And the main enemies of the crawlers, the Ambulls. Somehow Ambulls have managed to follow them onto other worlds. I don't know about that. I can't see Ambulls developing their own technology. And just like Ambulls, when you play the game, crawlers just appear at random on the table. Then we have Crotalids. I think Crotalids get a lot more in later books, and they appear in some of the Rogue Trader roleplay game and things. A Crota Lid is basically a crocodile. In fact, it is a crocodile to the point that they note in the comments, there's an author's note that says that this creature is inspired by the availability of toy plastic crocodiles and the cheapness of them. So a Crota Lid is essentially a crocodile on your gaming table. There's a couple of things that are interesting about it. One of the things is that it can travel via the warp. So a swarm of Crotalids can suddenly just teleport from one planet to another via the warp. Nobody knows how that means, but it means they can just appear just anywhere. They don't seem to have any control over it. So it really is random, a very hit and miss process. But it does mean that they can't be packed together. They can't be tracked. And anyone who they've tried to domesticate them, being the Imperium, these are big creatures, there's a potential for a food source, but if you ever keep 3 or more together, they just teleport away. In fact, so far all the animals we've looked at doing it this way, they don't have much luck at all domesticating creatures in the Imperium, but we'll see some that have been domesticated in a bit. One other thing about the Crotolid is it's a real word in the real world, and it's just another name for a pit viper, the Cthellan Cudbear. So a a Cthellan Cudbear is a native of the death world of Cthel. It's got long claws, teeth, and it's got shaggy purple hair. But otherwise than that, it's noted that it looks like a traditional Terran bear. Okay, so basically we've got a giant purple bear. The thick fur is really good at protecting from the cold and the environment of the planet that it lives on. So Cthel we now know is a cold world, and it's a natural predator. It's very territorial. It's been known to climb onto other spacecraft and hitch lifts to other places in search of food and to menace the crews. It's basically a random monster for your games that you can use a kind of model bear for. One of the interesting things, the colour. So the fact that this is a giant purple bear, I kind of thought we might be looking at some sort of Barney the dinosaur reference. But it's got quite a historical origins to it. Cudbear is a purple dye that was made in Scotland in the 18th and 19th century. Now, the name Cudbear, so they introduced this special colour, called it Cudbear, was actually from the name Cuthbert. Interestingly, there's quite a few times, and so Rip Priestley, I think, has some sort of interest in dyes, because Fulgrim, the Phoenicians were known for their dyes, the Primarchs. We also look at the sword in Carmine that Sanguinius has. In Carmine is a dark red dye, and then there's Ultramarine, which is a blue colour. There's kind of a slight theme in Rogue Trader and therefore in Warhammer 40,000 of different coloured dyes being used for things. We then have another creature. And this is just mentioned in Rogue Trader. It's not got a stat block of its own. There's the Cthellan Jumping Bean. So again, this is a creature from Cthel. No details are given from this, apart from the description of it in a section on skirmishes in the rulebook on the encounter ideas. And it's basically said that it's someone who's as stupid as a Cthellan jumping jelly. So all we know is they're really stupid. And presumably they jump. Then there's dinosaurs. So dinosaurs, giant reptiles as they're known as, are quite common throughout the galaxy, especially on death worlds and then feral worlds. They can be the size of a land raider, they can be the size of a rhino. Quite often the planets where space marines recruit have dinosaurs inhabiting them, which helps make the space marines so tough, it's noted. Now, basically, the reason they do this is so that you can use your plastic dinosaurs in games of Warhammer 40,000, which is pretty cool. And then I also think, in another video, I talked about tie-ins of Rogue Trader and Games Workshop with 2000 AD. Now, as well as Judge Dredd and Nemesis the Warlock, who are huge inspirations over Rogue Trader and 140k, 2000 AD had a comic called Flesh. Now, in the comic of Flesh, it's about greedy ranchers from the far future who use a time machine to go back in time, and they basically farm dinosaurs for meat. Now, in this, the Imperium farm dinosaurs for their meat the same way. I'm sure I've read, now in Flesh, the dinosaur herders, they use robots to control them, and I'm sure it's the same thing with Imperial Knights. Imperial Knights, when they first landed on planets, were used to fight these kind of giant creatures. There's also one dinosaur in Judge Dredd and in Flesh that's a T-Rex called Old One-Eye. Old One-Eye gives their name to the Carnifex, the very first kind of Tyrannid special character, the Carnifex Old One-Eye, who was defrosted on Ultramar and can regenerate. And dinosaurs in Rogue Trader, they're pretty straightforward. They have a random initiative that you roll every time. So initiative used to be how you see at what speed a creature attacks. They have a random number of attacks and they move a random distance. But it does depend on the size of the creature how many attacks they get. So you can have your little velociraptors, but you can also have your giant T-Rex kind of causing trouble. Really cool idea. Right, I guess I better do something about light. It seems to be getting darker here. So E is for Enslavers. So these are one of the warp creatures as well. These are clearly one of the really quite threatening warp creatures here. Although they do basically look like somebody's got a kind of tennis ball and put a ping pong ball on top. And then they've got tentacles underneath. So they float. They're about 2 meters high. They've got a tough leathery skin. They can change their skill tone at will, but for some reason have settled mostly on a leathery brown. They've then got a central eye that sits on the very top of the body, and nobody knows what the function is. Their design, it's sort of, with the eyes and the tentacles, makes me think a little bit of the Beholder, which is a monster in Dungeons and Dragons, but there's clearly a few differences. Now, they have between 8 to 12 tentacles, and they travel the warp looking for prey, and they prey on Psychers, and then when they find a Psyker, they can turn this Psyker into a gate, and through this gate into the warp, other enslavers can arrive. Now, I think it's implied at some point in other books that there was once a massive enslaver empire who kind of ruled everything, and that enslavers were a bigger threat. Obviously, they've kind of been replaced by demons in the warp, so they're not such a big deal now. There were loads of rules for them in a game. They used to be able to possess models. This is how their enslaving comes around, so they could just take over members of your squad and make them fight you. They could do a psychic shock, which was essentially like a laser beam that they sent out. And then when they killed a Psyker, that's when they could turn the Psyker into a big fleshy mass and turn him into a gate, and then 3 more enslavers would appear. So there was quite a bit to worry about when you encountered enslavers. F is for Ferro Beasts. Ferro Beasts are fauna that are native to the mineral poor world of Yimbo Bim. They're basically like armadillos. They're about 2 meters long, they're quadrupedal, they have tough, rough shells, and they have kind of tentacles over their mouths. A bit like the Ambulls Genestealers that we'll see in a bit. There's little for them to live off. There's very little iron quantity in the environment, so what they do is they just suck food directly from mineral deposits, and that's where these suckers come in, these short tentacles on their mouths, so surrounded with suckers, and they can draw the iron, the mineral deposits out of rocks. Now, in the game, and they can basically detect metal, so they will travel over a great distance to get to this, and then they'll attack metal equipment. They're generally placid, but they will get pissed off if they're interrupted eating. In the game, they basically move towards the biggest metal object they can find, and on 4+, pretty much, they make that object useless. So they're quite a big threat. You know, if your Land Raider is suddenly under attack by Pharaoh Beasts, you got a bit of a problem. So they're a fun creature to fight against. They're also, they seem to be, to me, to be inspired again by Dungeons and Dragons. There is a rust monster. Now, a rust monster has a similar kind of look. There's the same kind of design cues. It's got the tentacled mouths. It is 4-legged. If you look at kind of a picture of the two of them, you can see that they're kind of similar. Now, I know I'm saying that Dungeons and Dragons has influenced a lot of these, and I imagine you're thinking, well, it could be the other way around. The reason I think Dungeons & Dragons influences Warhammer 40,000 and not the other way around is mainly, although Dungeons & Dragons came out in the late 70s, Rogue Trader came out in the sort of mid-late 80s, 1987. Now, Games Workshops, basically they started by importing Dungeons & Dragons. That's how they started in business. And then Citadel Miniatures produced models that you would use to play games of Dungeons & Dragons. So you'd go through a dungeon, like Warhammer Quest, you know, you've got your adventurers, you've got your monsters they could fight. So there could well have been rust monsters made by Citadel Miniatures that this would then help you use. Now, over time, Citadel Miniatures were making these models, but you only ever use them to play Dungeons & Dragons. So you'd largely have a party and then 3 or 4 monsters that they're fighting against. You could build these massive collections of models. Now, I think it was Brian Ansell at the time. It was certainly, I think he was the head of Citadel Miniatures at the time, while Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson had founded Games Workshop. You'll know them from the Fighting Fantasy books. Anyway, Brian Ansell basically they decided they want to make a game that allows you to use these miniatures, and that's when Warhammer comes about. It's basically to give you a game to play with your Dungeons & Dragons model, and then Warhammer becomes, when you want a futuristic version of it, Warhammer 40,000. So that's why I believe Dungeons & Dragons has influenced a lot of Games Workshop. Obviously, that was 30 years ago, 40 years ago that Dungeons & Dragons came out. So, you know, these have gone their separate ways and they've evolved into very separate beasts. But it's interesting to think about the origins of them. We've then got the Genestealer. So this is the Ermgul Genestealer. They've not yet been connected with the Tyranids, although they still inject their eggs into someone and then they kind of carry them like a cuckoo. They inhabit, we already find out that they inherit certain abilities of their prey, and they'll gain that. But whenever they use the slugs on their home planet of Ermgul, a pure strain Genestealer is made. So until they're connected with the Tyranids, we actually see in the old orc lists, which came out before the Tyranid Codex, there used to be Genestealer orcs who were Genestealers who'd been infected by Genestealers, sorry, who were orcs who had been infected by Genestealers, and you get these orc hybrids. You then also, in the game Space Hulk, you end up with, while you're fighting pure strain Genestealers in the first game, you then end up with Genestealer hybrids, which are more human looking and can start to use weapons. And of course those become the Genestealer cult. The Genestealer cult is about before, as an army, before the Tyrannids are. But then Tyrannids get their list to kind of become their big thing. But again, lately we've seen a big revival as Games Workshop seem determined to just produce more and more awesome stuff from their past. We now see Genestealer cults as a fully fledged army. In terms of games terms, Genestealers, again, they're a random monster, and they are just rock in close combat with their claws. You just want to steer clear of them. It's also noted that Genestealers, you can have different hybrids, such as wolf Genestealers, Razorwing Genestealers. So these can kind of, like, you take an already awkward creature like a Razorwing or a wolf, and you give it bigger claws and bigger teeth, basically. There's giant insects, pretty straightforward. These are giant bugs. This is before the film of Starship Troopers. There's small, medium and large bugs. Some of them can spit venom at you. Some of them can fly. They're basically there to be a nuisance, kind of a Death World nuisance. As are our next creature, giant spiders. Giant spiders also come in 3 sizes. They tend to live in kind of webs or lairs, and it's suggested there that when you're playing a game with giant spiders, effectively they should be something that you can avoid if you want to, so you go around it. So it's basically a piece of terrain that if you want to run the risk of going through, then great, but you may want to walk around it and avoid the spiders. Next up we've got the Grox. Grox are large lizard creatures. They're not dissimilar to the Crotalids. They're kind of like crocodiles but taller. In fact, more like kind of herd animals. They're very big, and they're basically bred for meat by the Imperium, and they're actually one of the successful domestic stories. They're not able to dig their way out of where you keep them. They don't teleport off randomly, so they will stay there. And although when I do say domesticate, they're not domesticated like horses might be. They're domesticated because they get lobotomized, and they need to do that because these are very aggressive creatures, and as such they make great kind of monsters on the battlefield just to randomly turn up and kind of give you guys grief. They're quite strong, they're quite tough. I think strength 5, toughness 5. So, they take a bit of keeping down, but they're not horrendous. So there's the Gyrinx. The Gyrinx is a large cat. It's got thick, fluffy ginger fur, bright blue eyes. It can grow to about 1 metre in length, so quite a big cat. They're not so much intelligent, but they empathise a lot with their master, and they can actually form a bond with their owner where it's kind of like a friendship. Reading about them, they'll guard the bodies of their owners if they fall down. They're loyal. They actually undergo a metabolic change where they begin to look like their owners physically and in temperament. They almost sound to me more like dogs, to be honest, than cats, which is awesome because I love dogs. And quite often they become attuned to creatures, and they'll be owned by psychers and things. In fact, they serve the role that familiars do in kind of the Warhammer world. You can actually store psi points in a Gyrinx and then draw on them as you need to. They also act as the eyes and ears. They give you enhanced bonuses there, so you get like +1 initiative when you've got one of these creatures near you that you're bonded with. Prized by Inquisitors and Rogue Traders, and while they were in the Rogue Trader game, they've kind of appeared with the Ivrain, the emissary of Iniad, the elder god of death. She has a pet Gyrinx. And then there's this fantastic piece of art as well of an Eldar, I think warlock, with a Gyrinx. There's horses, the simple horses in the game. We've seen them in Rough Riders, where they're basically stronger than usual horses, so that they can carry an armoured Imperial Guardsman. And they can be used as dwarfs as pets. And then there's giant ones that would even dwarf a Shire horse that are used, on feral worlds to pull carts and ploughs and things. Then L is for Lashworms. So Lashworms are a native of the Death World of Lost Hope. They've spread onto other worlds and been accidentally introduced, as they get picked up by spaceships and things, such is the way of most of these creatures. They are infected. In fact, you get a lot of the background in this. They are in the Necromunda Underhive as well, although that's not in the Rogue Trader book. That's added later on. They're basically a 5-metre whip that comes out. They attack with their tail. It's razor sharp, and they'll strip out a chunk of flesh before coiling back up into the crevice where they hide. in the game, they're immobile, and they're basically a way of making a particular area of the battlefield a little bit dangerous. You know, perhaps you've got an objective there, and suddenly this is whipping out at you. There's mimics. Mimics are kind of cute little kind of monkey creatures. They enjoy basically, well, mimicking people. They'll copy them, they'll follow them around the battlefield. So they're just a bit of a nuisance creature, but they can actually kind of shape change. Like they can take on the appearance of people. It won't pass kind of close inspection, but they'll give you a general impression. And then they also want to get hold of the equipment from the people that they're mimicking. So to begin with, they're quite inquisitive, but of course they'll become more of a liability if they actually start to get hold of your gear. They can shape change into orcs, human, any other man-sized Xenos, and then they can mimic their behaviour, and sometimes using weapons and tools. When they either when you go away, the person they're mimicking they go away, they'll return to their normal form, or if they're killed, they'll return to their normal form as well. There's Ptera Squirrels. So Ptera Squirrels are basically, well, they're cute squirrels. They're great little pets. They're kind of like flying squirrels, so they have a membrane between their arms, which allow them to fly short distances. And they're really popular as pets in the Imperium. But every few generations, they just turn into they go from being very harmless, very peaceful creatures, and then they produce these absolute abominations, these monsters that look exactly the same as them, but are just savage killers. So there's always the risk that they get on a planet and then, you know, you think you've got a load of pets, and then suddenly you've got a load of savages to deal with the next generation. It's a really, I mean, it's the second kind of terror pun they have, as well as Ptera Squirrels, Ptera. We also have terror as in Terra, being Earth, and that gives us the Lords of Terror. So it's certainly a pun that Rick Priestley seems to like. So the next P is the Psychneuein, which took me a while to kind of get the joke when I did the original Rogue Trader one. I think this is kind of a play on sucking you in being in the name, so Psychneuein. And this is a warp creature. It basically resembles about a 2 metre long wasp, and what it does is it attacks psychers and it lays its eggs. In fact, it psychically projects their eggs into the brain of a psyker. There those eggs hatch, and the larvae basically devours the psyker's brain. It sucks them in. They're in Rogue Trader as something of a nuisance creature for you to have. They also turn up in the book Thousand Suns. They come back, and I think the Thousand Suns had to clean out infestations of them on the planet Prospero so that they could live. But again, it's quite a cool creature. Not much seems to happen with it between Rogue Trader and now, but then the Horus Heresy brings it back in. It's really nice to see these things kind of coming in from from the original books and being brought back to life again. There's rules for both the adults and the grubs in the book. The adults are ferocious, they're fast, they've got a high weapon skill, so they're good at hitting, they're very strong, they're very tough. The grubs, on the other hand, are just slow and just kind of wander around, but they can spontaneously become the adults, so you've got to watch out for that. There's Razorwings. Razorwings are birds of prey, very large birds of prey. They literally have, so they look kind of like eagles and hawks, but they literally have razors running down the front of their wings that they can use to fly in and attack people. They're meant to be incredibly intelligent, they can hunt in packs. They're generally a nuisance creature. One of the plots suggested here is that maybe an imperial governor wants to capture some of the eggs from a flock of them, so you've got to find the nest on the table, and obviously you're going to get attacked by these at the same time. They also, Razorwings, appear later on in the games as Dark Eldar Beastmasters begin to use them. There's Rippy fish. Rippy fish are basically piranhas, but whereas piranhas just live in fresh water, these can also live in salt water. They go around in huge swarms, shoals, isn't it, with fish? So there's huge shoals of them. They'll basically infect an area of river, and they will attack vehicles or anything like that goes in them. They're just a great way of making a piece of terrain a bit more interesting. So there's swarms. Swarms represent a swarm of creatures. So they might represent hundreds of rats. They might represent thousands of insects in an area. What you normally have is, like, say, a 50mm base, and that is filled with these creatures. But you don't want to be worrying about individual rats. So you just treat them as one massive swarm that you deal with. They tend to move randomly. As a bulk of creatures, they're a problem. An individual rat's not a problem, but 1,000 of them suddenly attacking you is a bit of an issue. They're just a fun kind of creature. They're a lot more popular, I think, in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, where for ages the armies would have access to different types of swarms. So, Skaven would definitely have rat swarms, Lizardmen would have snake swarms. So there was more variety there, and you got more models over time. At this point, I think they suggest that you basically just either represent it by a piece of cardboard that's kind of coloured in, or you have a base and just have you have 3 or 4 rats. Obviously, that represents hundreds of them. Another good kind of crossover there, where you can use your Warhammer models in Warhammer 40,000. Then there's Sunworms. So Sunworms, they're another creature from Luther McIntyre 9. They're basically a fat, large maggot, oily covered maggot. They don't have eyes or any other sensory organs, and they basically just sit there and they just absorb the sun. And then later on, they will release all of that energy. There's an idea that maybe they could be harnessed by the Imperium as a source of energy if they could somehow be domesticated. They're basically big creatures that kind of sit there and occasionally flare up. I can't make my mind up by reading the rules. It tells you, I'll read this out. They have a habit of hiding under rocks, which means they're difficult to see at the last moment. They have 1 attack in combat for each 30 centimetres of body length. This can be determined for each creature as d6 times 30 centimetres or d6 attacks. So that's 30 centimetres? I'm assuming from what it says from under the rock that is 30 centimetres in the game. So they'll be a lot smaller than that. Don't imagine it's 30 centimetres of worm on the table. It's kind of really hard to judge what scale they mean from it, though. I mean, in June, they have these giant sandworms, which wouldn't be out of place if you had a 3-foot sandworm on the table. That would represent it. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sure what they intended there. From the hiding under rocks, it sounds like they're 30 centimetres, as in small. But you never know. Then there's vampires. Vampires basically drain the energy from people. They're warp creatures. They drain psi points and they drain willpower from people. Remember, at this point, you don't just have a leadership characteristic. You've got intelligence, willpower, leadership, and cool that make up the sort of mental characteristics of a character. So vampires will drain those away, and then they'll basically bring you back as a zombie. I'll talk about zombies in a moment. They can shape change, although shape changing, they can change into bats and wolves, all the kind of standard vampire stuff, but it does take d6 rounds, so potentially it could only mean that Rogue Trader games must have lasted a bit longer than just 6 rounds. I've not played a game of 40k in the last 10 years that has gone past 6 rounds, so you could literally just be shape changing and that would be it. The art for them is really cool. These aren't just men in suits, these giant bat-winged creatures. Now, They have very similar abilities, and I think they're taken from the film Life Force. So Life Force, or I think it's called Space Vampires, was released in 1985, so 2 years before Rogue Trader came out. I love it. It's a very B-movie film. Basically, Halley's Comet is going past. Some astronauts go up there, they investigate it, they find a spaceship hidden in the comet. In that comet are some coffins. They find 2 guys and a girl, and basically they come back, the girl comes out, wakes up, they drain the life from people, hence Life Force, and that leaves them as these husks, leaves them as the zombies, which is just how the vampires work in Rogue Trader. And the look of them, this kind of humanoid bat, is the vampire's true form there. If you take a look at this picture, I think you can see the similarities. There's warp entities. So I said at the beginning there aren't really demons in Rogue Trader. These basically are demons. They live in the warp. The picture of one kind of looks like a bull-headed creature, sort of like a bloodthirster. And their stats are all random, so yeah, you never know quite what you're going to encounter, but there are greater and lesser warp entities, essentially. And they basically try to gain psi points off people by killing them. They have to do that to stay on this world, and on this plane. And so you keep track of the psi points. Every turn they lose psi points. When they run out, they disappear. They cause fear or terror, and they can also influence people into following them and doing what they say. So our last creature is zombies. Zombies are created when vampires suck the life out of someone. I think enslaved people are also zombies. They're basically the same stats as when they were alive, but they're fearless. So these aren't really slow zombies particularly. They just have no free will. So that's been an overview of all of the creatures and warp creatures in Rogue Trader. Hope you've enjoyed it. I said in a post previously on YouTube, I'm trying to get hold of copies of older books as well, so like chapter approved, compendium, compilation, and I'll read through those. Also with Epic coming out soon, the new Horus Heresy, I'm going to try to get hold of some of the Epic books and talk to a friend who loves Epic, so share those with you as well. So thank you very much for listening. Please like this video, share it, and please subscribe. Thank you for your time. Cheers.